right, can you hear me okay? I'm really honored to be a part of Bioneers. Carol Hoover, who I've been working with for the last 20 years, had been telling me about Bioneers for years and years, and it never worked into my schedule that I could actually make it down here. And then when I finally did, this other indigenous youth leader, Clayton Thomas Mueller, who's fighting the tar sands, doing amazing work to stop that project from happening. He saw me here and he snuck me into a luncheon over at what they call the green room, where all the funders hang out. And so I went in there and he sat me down at Kenny and Nina's table because he wanted to introduce me to them and thought that we should know each other. And about a dozen to 15 different funders kept coming up to me and thanking me, so I never got a chance to say hello to Kenny and Nina. And they kept interrupting me and kept thanking me for the work that we were doing in Alaska, and so it was kind of embarrassing. But finally Kenny walked over and he goes, "Who the hell are you anyway?" I said, "We finally meet, you know." And then shortly after that I was asked to do a workshop and give a plenary. And after the plenary, they asked me to be on the board of directors. And so I've been really fortunate to hang out with all these amazing people around the world for the last 4 or 5 years. And I get inspired every time I come here and hear some of these stories and these struggles and these fights. Because coming from Alaska, and especially Cordova, where I live in Alaska with Pamela, a lot of times we feel really alone. You know, we feel like we're the only ones standing up and fighting for what's right and doing everything we possibly can to not only be louder than everything else, but a voice of reason that can help bring attention to the plight of the salmon and what's happening in the area. My friend Anuja earlier or last night asked Pamela and I to share a little bit of our story and, you know, how we got involved in this community activism and how you know, we grew up with salmon and how that's a part of not only our culture but our fight to you know, get attention from the world to help us save it. First off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Eyak people. We migrated out of the interior of Alaska about 3,500 years ago, and we came across the ice fields down to this place called Eyak Athabaskan, which is an Eyak word that means lagoon behind the sea. And we hit the shore, and the Tlinkits were coming out of the southeast, and they loved our women, so we scooted across the delta towards Cordova, 300 miles to the west, where we ran into the Aleuts and the Tlinkits, who were warring tribes. And so when they came to the shore, we killed them. And the Tlinkits, because they were of Athabaskan descent, they, you know, brought in their war canoes and you know, went to war with us and helped protect us to keep us alive, and that's why we're even standing here today. And so when you think about the history of the Eyak people on the Copper River Delta, the reason we decided to hang out in Cordova, we figured that we'd stay there till it quit raining. And that was 3,500 years ago, and it still hasn't quit. Right before it started snowing, we got like 80 inches of rain, and Emily and Jeremy just came from Cordova, so they know what it's like there right now. But the rain has finally turned into snow, so winter's getting ready to start there. But as I was growing up, like all of our 7 siblings, as soon as we would get tall enough to reach the hydraulic handle to run the power block, then we were big enough to go fishing. And so we'd go out for 3 months at a time and spend time out on the water with our family. And we would always fish in this place called Unakawik. And Unakawik was just wonderful ecosystem. It was just like beautiful blue glacier waters and some of the most incredible spotted shrimp in the world and bottom fish, and there was king crab and tanner crab and just all this, you know, amazing abundance of seafoods. And when we get done fishing for the day, we'd come downstairs and Mom would be making seafoods again. We're going, "You're kidding me, we're having the seafoods again?" And, not realizing that this was, something that was really special, and it wasn't until we were older that we realized how special that was. And I remember seeing the first kayak and the first sailboat coming into Prince William Sound. That is when we knew it was the beginning of the end. We knew that we'd finally been discovered. And so, we'd sit and we'd talk sometimes. We go, they're going to keep coming, and those numbers are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they'd have. And with that came development, and with that came pollution and change. And I remember I must have been at least 12, 13 years old when we started crab fishing, and right in Cordova in Orca Inlet, right outside of the town of Cordova, we would fish for Dungeness right there in Orca Inlet. And I remember sitting down with my father one day, and I was baiting the pots, and I said, well, how come there's no escapement hatches for the babies or the mamas? And my father looked at me, he goes, what are you, an environmentalist? And I said, well, no, I'm just curious why there's no escape hatches, because when we pull those crab from the bottom of the sea to the surface and we throw them over, because we can't keep the mamas and babies, they become bait. And I don't know what their survival rate is, but I don't think it's very good. And he got really mad, and I remember he made all the crab pots in town. He had Lankard Construction and Welding. So I'd take him outside and school him in basketball, and I would tell them about the crab pots and why we needed these escape hatches. And I remember the day my father came into the shop, and Pamela remembers where I'd be working with Dad all the time, and I'd have this little iron cutter, and he came in and he threw these hog rings on the floor along with these rings that were about that big, and he said, you got your wish, now put them in every single crab pot we have. And unfortunately, this was by the early 70s. By 81, there was no more crustaceans in Prince William Sound. Because in 1964, the earthquake had happened, and when the earthquake happened, I don't know how geology works, but one of the bottom shelves of the ocean went right over the top of the other one. So when it did that, it killed everything on this shelf, and we fished out what was on top. And so by 81, it was pretty much over for Dungeness, for king crab, for Tanner crab, for spotted shrimp even. And that was tough to see that loss and that, that incredible bounty just disappear in our lifetimes. And then about the same time in the mid-70s, I guess a few years before, Cordova used to be called the razor clam capital of the world. And the earthquake also affected that fishery. And all of a sudden, by the early 80s, we couldn't get any more razor clams. And so, we saw lots of changes happen in our lifetime in this incredible place called Prince William Sound and the Copper River Delta. And so, like I was saying, we would go out as a fishing family. We were one of the last fishing families in the region, and we had this little tiny boat called the Lindaloo, and we'd go out, and I remember when another boat would come into the bay, into Eyak, my father would go storming out of the bay. And we were just happy to see other humans, we were like, jumping up and down. And my father didn't like fishing around anybody else. And so he said, there's too many people in the bay. And so it was interesting, his perspective and how much he loved the land and the ocean. And I remember when we would come to town from a fishing opener, which is a 12 to 24-hour fishing period depending on the fishery, and sometimes longer when you're fishing different species. We'd get into town, and he would do a drop of about a dozen different families where we would take subsistence foods and drop it off to each of these different community members. And I remember asking my father why we did that. And he said, well, they can't afford to go out there and subsistence fish. It costs a lot of money to have a boat and have the gear and spend the fuel and go out there and do that. And so we're already out there, and it's plentiful for us, and we always have abundance, so we're going to make sure that these people are fed. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized the value of that. Because, growing up, a lot of fishermen, because the price of king salmon goes so high, they don't even eat their kings. And so, I was given fisherman kings. I couldn't believe it. That, we have this incredible abundance of fish, and resource, but it really comes down to the dollar and how we're going to take care of our families and survive. And so as I got older, I tried to get into Native politics, and I kept getting shut down over and over by our Native corporations. By the end of the 80s, the Native corporations were planning on clear-cutting 1 million acres in the spill zone. So by 1989, when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, it was the largest oil spill of its kind in our backyard. And we were just, just devastated that not only did we get hit by, this worst oil spill, but our subsistence and our commercial fishing way of life now was on the verge of being lost again. And so I, was really close with my sister Pamela, and I would come home and I would talk to her, and we'd say, one day we're going to have to address the clear cutting that the Native corporations want to do. Well, Pamela was working at the Eyak Corporation office, and the CEO came running out of the back room and gathered everybody together, and he said, "We've just had the nation's worst oil spill. Now we must clear cut as fast as we possibly can while the eyes of the world is focused on this oil spill." And then I happened to be in Arizona. I was pioneering a fishery down there. And I just had a good day of fishing, had a $5,000 day. I was sitting down, I was putting my tennis shoes on, I kicked the door open, I popped open a beer, and I was seeing who was hot in basketball that day because I was going to take them to the hoop. And they're kicking up the dust, and I'm sitting there, and the phone rings, and it's Pamela. And I said, well, I'll just let her take a message, or I'll just listen to her message because I was going to play hoops. And she said, "Dune, it's Pamela. You need to come home and fight and try and help stop this clear cutting, because if you don't bother, because there's not going to be anything left to come home to." And tears just started pouring from my eyes, and I was like, I knew that it was over, that if we allowed 1 million acres of forest to be clear cut on the parallel path of the Exxon Valdez, we would not be subsistence or commercial fishing in 10 years or less. And we would end up like California, Oregon, and Washington. And so I sat down with Pamela, and I said, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And I'm, all animated and excited. And she says, well, can you live with the outcome if you do this? She said, you're very popular in this town because of your art and your basketball and your fishing. Are you willing to live with the outcome? Because not very many people are going to like you for standing up for the environment. And so I told her, I said, well, Pamela, if we do nothing at all, we will absolutely lose. Absolutely, our fishing way of life will be gone. But if we be a voice of reason and be louder than everything else and do everything we possibly can while it still matters, guess what? We will have made a difference, and we will win just by going in. And so that's what we did. And she gave me a hug, and I remembered I cried for an hour and a half that day. And you're redoing your floor. I remember that really well because I had to make sure I didn't fall in the cracks when tears were falling. And I remember that regardless of what happened, that this is something that I had to do. And we had to not only address Exxon, the biggest corporation in the world, we had to go and face our Native corporations and take on the very people that we were. We were fishermen, we were natives. But I became the most hated Native in the state for 7 consecutive years. We had to file lawsuits. Pamela filed lawsuits with me against our Native corporation. Our mama Rosie helped us. We went in there, and basically what we were asking for was a right for the shareholders to exercise their right to vote, to have a say in how the resources were managed. And basically before that, from 71 to the present, the only vote that any shareholder received was a vote on who got elected to the board. We didn't get to have a say in how the resources were managed or what would happen with our assets or what investments we would make, none of that. And so what had happened was filed a cultural suit in '92, filed a shareholder derivative action in 1995. We lost both those cases. We appealed. We went to the Alaska Supreme Court, where the Alaska Supreme Court decided 3-2 in our favor that we had public interest litigant status. And the importance of that status is this. Without having that status, you have to pay a bond to have your case heard. and you have to pay attorney fees to losing parties. So we were looking at a $50 million bond and $500,000 in attorney fees. And that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. And so we knew that if we had this status, that we would be able to at least go in and have our case heard. So Justice Rabinowitz, who happened to be a Jewish fella, he was fighting back leukemia. And so he had a morphine pack strapped to his back and for 3 years while he was writing his decision. And I remember one night I was playing ping pong and I met his law clerk who worked for him, and I kept telling him, we'll take our Eyak case and put it on top, because I knew that, that this guy was obviously on drugs and morphine for years, and that he had a case, I mean, he's Supreme Court Justice of Alaska, so his case, was probably that high, his pile. So his law clerk would take our file and put it on top at least 6 or 7 times over that 3 years. And so Justice Rabinowitz finally writes the decision. We win 3-2. The other 2 dissenting justices decide to challenge the decision, saying that it was a morphine-induced decision. Therefore, it shouldn't stand as law. So all 9 justices sat around and listened to the case and read it and said, well, wait a minute. If he was a voting judge only, then maybe we would listen to that argument. But since he wrote it, obviously whether he was on drugs or not, 2 thought it was great law and 2 thought it was bad law. So it stands as law. So we ended up winning. So our mama, I went down to see her in Arizona, because she had moved down there to be with Don and I. We went to Laughlin and celebrated. Well, Mom, 1 week later, had a stroke and lost her short-term memory. And so for the next 7 years of her life, every time she would see me, she'd go, well, how did we do on that case? And I go, we won. And so we would relive that over and over and over. But what had happened was, because we won, the shareholders were able to vote on the development of their land. And so we were able to preserve 75,000 acres of the Eyak rainforest and duplicated that vote in 13 other Native Corporation regions, and ended up saving 765,000 out of the 1 million acres that was scheduled to be clear cut. So that was a major, major victory for the Eyak people, but it was a major, major victory for the wild salmon. And so my life has always been a part of that salmon, the same as Pamela's, as she'll tell you here in a moment. But we are the salmon. When you eat that salmon, you are the salmon. There's a thing that we shared with a couple people yesterday when Pamela was smoking the salmon and we fed all these amazing folks up in Tiburon. Is when our salmon, the Copper River salmon, come back, they mill around for a couple of weeks, and they kind of swim around. Now they get to swim around a lot because of the regulation, and so all the inside of the barrier islands is closed, and so they're really happy and jumping and swimming on their backs. But what happens is, in that time, they have just, beat the trawlers out of the ocean. They got by the seiners, they got by the gill netters. They made it into the river system. Now they have to get by the seals, they have to get by the bears, the wolves, the eagles. And then when they get up to Chitna, 100 miles upriver, then they have to get by the dip netters and then the fish wheel people and then the sports fishermen in the spawning beds. So by the time this salmon gets home, it is only the best in the world that makes it home, right? And so we have the most amazing, and at the same time, if you take the environment into consideration, it's 12-knot currents and silty waters that's icy cold. And, there's glaciers, dropping off into the ocean, into the river, that doubles the size of the river. So it's an average of 150,000 cubic feet of water moving per second, doubling during the summer months when 25,000 salmon are swimming upriver a day. And so when we're out there and we're in this wild place, you can only imagine the energy that each one of these salmon possess in order to get to their homeland, in order to spawn and die and do it all over again. Well, when we harvest those salmon and we feed you, and that nourishes you, not only does that sustain you, but that's what helps you to continue to thrive and survive, because that energy of that salmon is now within you. And so we decided that in our lives that I realized that I needed to share that salmon with all of you. And so I can't even tell you how many thousands of meals that we've given away to people, because we know that if you had a chance to not only hear what we're doing, understand what we're doing, appreciate what we're doing, but you eat that salmon, there's no way that you're going to go all the way back home either. And so I decided that in my lifetime that my job is to do everything I possibly can to preserve that salmon habitat. And right now, I'll just be a second, then you can jump on here, Pamela, is that we're working on a 12,000 acre conservation deal to protect the Bering River coalfield. And our regional corporation has decided that they're interested in selling their 73,000 acres, not for conservation, but for development purposes. So by protecting these 2 tracts of land on the Copper River Delta, we'll essentially protect all 3 million acres of the Copper River watershed. And it's only going to happen because people like you care about people like me that are doing this work in Pamela, and all we're trying to do is keep everything the same. All of the energy that we expend, all of the words that we have to say, all of the things that we do, you know, sometimes we have to, you know, make banners and jump off of bridges and buildings and tell people this isn't the way to do it. We can live differently on this planet without having to destroy it in order to survive. And so we feel that the salmon is not only a symbol for indigenous peoples and people who live along the coast of temperate rainforest, but it's a way of life. And it's something that deserves to live, because the indigenous peoples that have subsisted off that resource, the commercial fishermen who still make a living off of it, we are all stakeholders, and we're all in this together. And the people who buy all of our salmon around the world, you're all part of it. And so the important thing now is to just, you know, work with each other and help us make a difference while we still can and while it still matters. And the last thing I'd like to say is that I now have a daughter. Her name is Ananda Rose, and she's 2.5. And, you know, and every time I leave her, I go, honey, and she's crying and hanging on to me and going, no, go, daddy. And I hold her and I go, honey, daddy's out to save the world, and it's for you. And she gets it. So she filed her first lawsuit when she turned 1. And she's taken on the state of Alaska over climate change and global warming, and her case has been appealed to the Alaska Supreme Court. And Texas just decided that the atmosphere is part of the public trust, and so Ananda's going to ride that wave, and she's going to be taking over where I leave off after Pamela.
Hello, everybody. Dune brought me from Alaska. It's pretty hot here. He says, you got to come up here and smoke some salmon in 40 degrees increase weather and feed all these people some incredible salmon from Alaska. I don't talk in front of groups of people, but I'll try and tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm here to pretty much support Dune. He usually introduces himself as Dementia Key, which means little bird that won't shut up. And I don't know why he didn't do it this time, but Grandma or Mama used to call, my older brother got married to this Mexican lady, and she talked a lot, and Grandma used to always say, there comes Dementia Key. And Dune inherited the name too right after her. My name is Dukach, and it was the first name that I got because I'm trying to think how old I was when I realized that there was one Eyak woman that spoke Eyak that was alive, and I thought she was the last speaker of our people. And I got real frantic, and I thought, I've got to get an Eyak name, and my mom didn't have one. my grandma, her name was Ataki. So anyways, I went to this woman and I said, I got to have an Eyak name before you die. So she said, give me 3 days and come back to me, then I'll give it to you. So I gave her 3 days, and I rushed to her house. I was pretty excited, and she said, she wasn't a very nice lady, and she said, your name's Dukach, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. It kind of sounded like, you know, I was gonna like throw up or something, you know. And I asked her what it meant, and she said, there's no meaning. You just remind me of the lady that carried that name. So I was really excited, and I kept saying, Dukach, 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 and it didn't have any meaning for me, but I just kept saying, this is my name. And it was, she had died, and another woman came into the scene, and she was an elder. Her name was Marie Joan Smith. She was very aggressive. I think she was waiting for this woman to die, but she stood up for the land, and she spoke Eyak, and it was pretty powerful for us Eyak people. Basically because I didn't know what Eyak meant, and it was pretty significant for me. So I went for, oops, I don't know what that was. I went to her and asked her if she knew what the name meant, and she said, that's not Eyak. So, you know, for a lot of years I was like, for the first time in my life, I had something to connect to, and then all of a sudden my world dropped out from underneath me. And she said, you're going to have to go down the coast and find out what that name means. So I went to a Tlingit elder, and I asked her what it meant, and she said, how'd you get that name? That's Tlingit. And she said, and I asked her what it meant, and she said, a woman from afar that carries an important message. And I went, oh my God, great. As I get older, it seems like my whole life has taken like a full circle. I didn't plan on being this emotional, I'm sorry. Whew. You know, I stand before you telling you that I'm Eyak, but it's been a long struggle trying to figure out what that means. I don't speak the language, and our last speaker died, and Dune and Carol Hoover and a bunch of people are really trying hard to document the language, what's left of it. They're doing a damn good job. But my part in it is, well, probably 30 years ago, I had a problem with drinking, and I quit, and my husband said, you really ought to pick up the fish. And I was really quite angry inside, and I didn't want to do it because it was too painful to be native. And I did it anyways. I couldn't think about it, but it came from in here. So I started doing the damn fish. And so it was a struggle, and it was 7 years before I'd even offer it to anybody. And my husband said, yeah, I think it's time that you can offer it now without killing anybody. But I want to say that through the 30 years that I've worked with this fish, I've had amazing things happen to me. And my message, my connection with Eyak and doing the fish has been an intense relationship. It hasn't been easy, but Anuja asked me, what's my connection between being Eyak with the salmon? And all I know is that I got to be doing it, and I got to try to bring as many people into it as possible, because I got healed by touching that fish. And I carry my grandma's name now. We had an Eyak ceremony in 1996, and the Eyak woman asked me to coordinate something that I never knew what I was coordinating. I'd never heard a drum, and I'd never been to a potlatch. But I just kept trying and kept doing it. So I'm standing up here to tell you that, you know, I'm an Eyak Indian from Alaska, and we're trying. Dune, there's not a lot of people that stand behind Dune, and I know what he's doing is right, even if it's to carry some message to you guys, and I guess that's why I'm here too, just to share that. Keep doing whatever you're doing, because it makes the world of difference in today. Here I am in California with my salmon, and it's such an awesome experience to be able to share that with you guys and maybe create some healing. Thank you.